Jazz Day to highlight jazz and its diplomatic role of uniting people in all corners of the globe. Every year, hundreds of jazz musicians from around the world gather at cities that successfully bid to host the event. Over the years, hosts have included Istanbul, Osaka, Paris, Washington, D.C., Havana, St. Petersburg and Melbourne. Earlier this week, UNESCO announced that South Africa, Cape Town to be precise, will be the first African host of the event in 2020. While to tell us what this means for South Africa and the entire jazz landscape, we are joined by Spin Foundation Chairperson and Musicologist, Dr. Motsumi Makhene. It's great to have you in studio. Thank you so much for making the time.
Good morning and happy 25 years.
Yes, happy 25 years to you too. Now, for someone who may not know what International Jazz Day is or how it came about, why don't you briefly just take us through that and what the inspiration was?
Well, South Africa next year has the privilege to welcome the world to South Africa, to exchange South Africa's heritage with the world. The International Jazz Day will be held in Cape Town next year. It's going to be a big year for South Africa, for South African arts, for South African jazz.
And so what, in the broader scope, what do you think it means for the genre itself and just the entire jazz landscape?
Okay. Just before I talk about the landscape, International Jazz Day is about gathering the whole world to celebrate cultural diplomacy, to make sure that we grow a world that is peaceful, and also to make sure that there is cultural diversity. Hence, it happens under the auspices of UNESCO. What does it mean for us? It means gathering to reflect on the connections between South African and African arts, particularly African jazz, with jazz in America. For us, as South Africa, we have chosen the roots and routes of jazz in order to demonstrate how we have evolved as a country. We are celebrating 25 years today, and we hope that after the political transition, we will be rebuilding the country, and the driver or the energy to do so will be cultural regeneration of South Africa. So for us, we'll be talking about issues such as intellectual property and what it means to artists, what it means to heritage. We'll be talking about how jazz education can help to transform the curriculum of our education system, because a good country operates on a sense of strong identity, a sense of strong heritage, and within that, the arts are very active in mobilizing society to recreate itself.
Let's talk about the position of South African jazz out there in the world. Obviously not in terms of ranking, but just in terms of how influential and impactful South African jazz has been and South African jazz figures have been in the broader global community.
South African jazz has evolved along American jazz. Every step from the good old days of swing to bebop to freeform jazz. And in fact, South African jazz has contributed a lot in Europe through freeform jazz, the Blue Notes, people like Louis Moholo, Johnny Gianni, have actually created a musical environment in Europe that has created hope for a future, for a new humanity. So when you look at people like Abdullah Ibrahim or Hugh Masekela, who was the ambassador until he passed on of African jazz, he was one of the more than 200 ambassadors that would go from one country to another to have exchanges between the major high-profile jazz artists and communities to teach, run workshops, discuss jazz, listen to jazz. And so we have been along for I would say 100 years, evolving, particularly because jazz is a youth form, it is also an urban form, and with the creation of urban areas in South Africa, your marabi, your kwela, your guma music, your mbaqanga is part of urban existence which we evolved into. And essentially, we are among the best in the world as South Africa when it comes to jazz. And because it's a youth form, we want to make sure through International Jazz Day to reconnect young people to their history, to their legacy, in order to rebuild.
Speaking of reconnecting, the theme is the tracing the roots and routes of African jazz. How significant is that, especially in our world where young people now have to take the bait in, and we're seeing young people in jazz in South Africa doing extremely well. We're talking the likes of Nduduzo Makhathini and many others.
Look, I mean, the future of South African jazz lies in the youth. If you look at what they're trying to do as young people, reconnecting, it reminds one of people like Philip Dabane, who in the 60s showed an important connection between urban jazz and jazz healing in the form of Malombo. You have people like Abdullah Ibrahim, who would talk about how he learned from Kipu Mwekezi, who was influenced by rural music, in particular Giba music of South Africa. So we are in a type of renaissance now where young people can feel the need to reconnect with the past, reconnect with their legacy, in order to grow the strength of jazz, South African jazz internationally.
I'm really curious. I know earlier you spoke about workshops where discussions will be held and certain things within the music fraternity will be discussed. Or take us through just some of those themes that will be spoken about.
Basically, as I indicated, there will be two major conferences. One looking at jazz education and its role in the transformation of the school curriculum. As we speak, there is a whole global movement looking at decolonization, and we've had students rising to say it's not just about free education, but it is about quality and meaningful education as well. So in order to change the university curriculum, you have to start from scratch by reviewing the school curriculum. And the role of the arts in the curriculum is important in the sense that the world has begun to look at the relationship between the arts and science education. And it's about convergence, so we are trailing behind. So one of the discussions among jazz educators, researchers, and institutions will be to see how best to position South African education. But also, because we've had recently controversy around the recent IP legislation. It's about how do we protect intellectual property in South Africa, but in a structured and meaningful manner, because we're impacted on by the globe. And so the discussion will be how to reorganize and create archives for the protection of our legacy. That's one major discussion. The celebration, as it were, will be in the form of a huge global concert that has grown to more than 160 countries in the world, involving close to 1.2 billion people. So it's a huge celebration, and South Africa and SABC, we hope, as a public service institution, as a public broadcaster, will be part of connecting the world to South Africa.
All right, Mr. Makhene, I'd have to wrap it up there with you, but thank you so much for your time this morning.
You're welcome.
Well, that was Spin Foundation Chairperson and Musicologist Motsumi Makhene speaking to us about the announcement that was made earlier this week that South Africa will be the first African host of International Jazz Day. It is an initiative of the Herbie Hancock Institute and United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. We take a quick break. Do stay with us. We'll bring you a whole lot more when we return.